Welcome to our module on meeting the moment with a trauma-informed approach. In this module, we'll be taking a look at the paradigm shift of trauma-informed approaches, along with an overview of key terms and concepts for thinking about policy through a trauma-informed lens. From there, we'll talk in general terms about identifying trauma-informed policy, as well as building capacity for implementation also through a trauma-informed lens. Finally, we'll take a look at a very high-level look at what you might find useful to consider if you find yourself in a place where you need to draft a new policy to address your issue through a trauma-informed lens. Let's dive in. As we've discussed through this series, many health and social ills are interrelated as well as linked to experiencing trauma, and policy and advocacy are critical tools for building resilience and capacity to heal and protect against further harm. Because of the influence of trauma on many adverse physical and mental health outcomes, a trauma-informed approach is relevant to this strategy as a whole, as well as to many specific policies. This paradigm shift from what's wrong with to what happened to requires a long-term effort that is unlikely to produce quick, dramatic accomplishments. But each step forward builds on the ones before it, making progress toward the full integration of trauma-informed principles into the policies and practices across all contexts and sectors. Currently, a host of policies at the federal, state, and local levels need to change to reflect what the science has taught us about the causes and effects of childhood, adult, intergenerational, historical, cultural, racial, secondary, and collective trauma. With considerable recent media coverage, the link between trauma and many health and social problems that appear in our society occupy a place of interest in the eye of the general public, in researchers, and among public health practitioners. Now is a uniquely ripe time to expand on the shift toward trauma-informed approaches that are already underway in various service systems and on smaller scales to promote a parallel transformation in social policy. Let's start with trauma. There are many definitions out there, and so to create a common framework to work from, we want to let you know that we're looking at the SAMHSA definition of trauma, which involves what you may know as the 3 E's, because it honors the individualized nature of the myriad ways trauma may unfold across the life course. Essentially, trauma, for the purposes of this series, is defined as an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and/or spiritual well-being. And on this slide, you'll see some other key definitions that will be important to recognize as you move through this module in particular. I'd invite you to pause this slide too, as it's loaded with definitions, and we know that there are differential levels of knowledge and experience with the language folks are arriving with. So please do take your time. Take a look at the definitions that are new to you, or ones that you think you could use a quick review on, and then when you're ready, we'll continue together. Let's begin with what we mean when we say neuroscience. In the last 3 decades, scientific research has demonstrated how deeply trauma becomes embedded into biology, behavior, and risk, and how these can be passed on to future generations. This body of science, neuroscience, epigenetics, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and resilience, or NEAR, is one of the most significant public health discoveries of our time. This is also all nested within what we call a lifespan perspective, which says that each of these areas of the science provide clues for how to address trauma across the lifespan. And ideally, we hope to see these integrated into policies, as we believe that this framework is critical to helping to strengthen families and communities. Neuroscience is about understanding the nervous system, the spine, and the brain, including discovering the role of emotions relative to memory in the brain, understanding brain states, recognizing the capacity we have available through neuroplasticity, or the changing of the brain as trauma happens and heals over time, all of which help us determine to intervene and support resilience and recovery across the lifespan. Epigenetics demonstrates that the body is always adapting. Our DNA is not our destiny, and that is an important message to remember yourself and also to deliver to legislators that you educate. Just as the ability to transfer trauma across generations is clear, so too is our ability to heal from generation to generation with the right intervention and support. Recognizing the intergenerational nature of trauma and resilience is key to our work. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, can have a lasting impact that unfolds over the life course, and we will zoom into that a bit more in a moment. Finally, resilience is the capacity or ability to adapt to, prevent, or mitigate the impacts of an adverse event or trauma. Resilience is a capacity that can be developed or it can be inherent and exercised. Resilience at the structural and institutional level versus just the individual level is key to our work. So this is an overview of ACEs, and going back to that, we encourage you to think about ACEs through the lens of the expanded Philadelphia ACEs study linked in our resources, as well as the Building Community Resilience Framework. You may have seen the Pair of ACEs tree that includes factors related to racism, poverty, violence, and the other elements of toxic stress that can have impacts across the health and life trajectory of individuals and systems. One thing that we believe it is very important to acknowledge is that we take a population risk approach, which acknowledges that individuals exposed to similar early risks have divergent outcomes rather than one's fate being sealed by early developmental adversity. Digging more deeply into that framework of systems-level experiences that comprised the outer orbit of the graphic on the last slide, the premise of historical and cultural trauma is that populations historically subjected to long-term mass trauma like colonialism or slavery or war or genocide exhibit a higher prevalence of disease even several generations after the original trauma occurred. So it really is about addressing what's still happening now. The ACEs pyramid on the left, juxtaposed to the triangle encompassing the large-scale impacts that we often see unfold due to exposure to racial, cultural, and historical trauma, are depicted. The base refers to the generational impact, as well as the current social context, including implicit bias, microaggressions, and other such experiences that can compound to bring about complex trauma, and the effects cascade across one's life course and again potentially through further generations without intervention at the institutional and structural level through trauma-informed and trauma-responsive policy. Given what we've talked about so far, we invite you to consider, what do you already know about trauma-informed policy? How might you identify whether a policy is trauma-informed? And what would you consider to be the larger policy priorities related to a trauma-informed approach? The work of Jonathan Pirtle, assistant professor at Drexel University, provides a useful framework for conceptualizing the broad range of public policy issues that are related to trauma. These three policy categories all are important in creating trauma-informed and resilient institutions and systems. First, as you see on the slide, trauma preventive policies help reduce exposure to trauma and create the conditions for safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments. Trauma-informed policies are designed to raise awareness about trauma, both primary and secondary, and to promote trauma-informed practice. Trauma-specific policies increase access to interventions and services that mitigate the impact of trauma and promote healing. So in terms of what some of this could more specifically look like, it's important to recognize that policy is fraught with compromise, and just as trauma-informed programming may not fully actualize all principles of trauma-informed care at all times, it is unlikely that any single policy or article of legislation will fully reflect all of the principles outlined in the framework. The framework instead provides a conceptual overview of some aspects of policies that reflect trauma-informed approaches to varying degrees. It has been said that one good idea can solve many problems. Embracing a broader perspective, then, of what counts as potential public policy solutions to address and prevent trauma increases the possibility for alignment, action, and partnership. For instance, you may see provisions related to practitioners being mandatorily trained in trauma-specific interventions or trauma-informed care. Or you may notice that members of the community who access trauma-specific services must be included in work groups chosen to devise national training standards for community-based health centers, or any of the other aspects that you notice on this slide. I'd invite you to pause here because it's a pretty text-heavy slide, and you may want to take a quick look at some of the possibilities that we notice trending in trauma-informed policy of late to inform your own advocacy efforts. Achieving policy change of this significance and magnitude, though, it requires multiple strategies. At a minimum, there's a need to educate elected officials about ACEs science, trauma-informed programs, and legislative or regulatory changes required to make public policy more supportive of resilience, health, and well-being for all. There's also the critical need to connect the dots for them between ACEs and adverse community experiences, and increasingly, adverse climate experiences in order to create urgency and accountability for prevention-focused public policies that target trauma and its cascading and compounding impacts across society. Addressing individual, family, community, and systems trauma requires a comprehensive, multifaceted public health approach. For our systems to be trauma-informed and resilient, they must have the resources available at each level of intervention to address a population's needs appropriately. The bottom level of this pyramid depicts a public health framework described as how the enactment of trauma-preventive, trauma-informed, and trauma-specific policies place a greater focus of attention and resources upstream to address the social determinants of health that, at a population level, have been connected to trauma and adversity. While such a model requires great investment upfront, there's ample evidence that moving from more of a reactive crisis response model to more preventative models can ward off some of society's most pressing problems, and their costs are avoidable when people and communities are supported through a trauma-informed, resilience-building, and healing-centered lens. Primordial prevention efforts refer to programs that target social and economic policies that influence communities or individuals' health. The most effective public health interventions are those that continue to bring together knowledge of people with lived experience, as well as evidence-based, evidence-informed, and promising practices in complementary, respectful, and mutually beneficial ways. Primary prevention consists of population-based interventions intended to address the underlying causes and risk factors associated with poor outcomes. The purpose of primary prevention is to prevent trauma from ever occurring. Secondary and tertiary prevention efforts both involve attempts to address adverse outcomes that have already occurred. More specifically, secondary prevention focuses on reducing the effect of an adverse outcome, thus halting the progression and mitigating the impact of the trauma that has already occurred to thwart long-term and/or intergenerational outcomes. Finally, tertiary prevention refers to reducing the complications or harms of adverse outcomes, as well as preventing reoccurrence. A trauma-informed system is one in which all parties realize the prevalence of trauma individually and collectively, and the presence of strength and resilience. Recognize how trauma affects directly and indirectly all involved within the system. Respond by putting this knowledge into practice by learning from community, promoting safety and cultural wellness. And finally, they actively seek to resist re-traumatization by ideally drawing from cultural resiliency, traditional healing tools, and collective wisdom. And that is another SAMHSA model known as the 4 R's of trauma-informed approaches. The pandemic has knit together the interdependencies between collective trauma and other outcomes of well-being and resilience for the public to see. And so the time is ripe to encourage a trauma-informed response, which involves enlivening the core principles of a trauma-informed approach that you see on the slide, including safety, trustworthiness and transparency, empowerment, voice, and choice, collaboration and mutuality, cultural, historical, and gender issues, and peer support or mutual self-help. The meaning of resiliency to trauma-informed policy and practice advocates goes far beyond people and systems having the ability to withstand or endure hardship, and actively and intentionally includes framing challenges to incorporate collective wisdom, history, creativity and coping, and other aspects that have helped with survival among trauma-impacted populations. The systems perspective is critical, as calling people resilient without acknowledging the need for equitable trauma-informed supports perpetuates the oppressive and re-traumatizing status quo. How those with lived experience find resiliency despite structural inequalities and pejorative discourses that objectify and marginalize them is critical to this framework, as we must acknowledge the ability of policy and institutions to block or unlock human potential. Individually and collaboratively, the adaptive and protective capacities on this slide, along with others, create resilience within a community. Knowing and really understanding the community's vulnerabilities, creating equitable access to health, wellness, and support services, as well as basic survival resources, infrastructure, governance, and leadership, economic investment and stability, positive relationships and social support, presence of and participation in community groups and networks, shared values, strong ties, cohesiveness, supportive spiritual community affiliation, along with opportunities for success and achievement and meaning-making, and finally, collective efficacy and sense of empowerment to generate a realistic sense of hope for a positive preferred future. All of these can contribute to resilient communities. We invite you to reflect on what you've noticed work in terms of selling using this trauma-informed lens in the past, and consider how you might translate those skills and strengths that you have to justifying trauma-informed policy action, specifically if that is something you've not done before. What would that look like? For change to happen, a community must engage in a process known as capacity building, or a process in which communities work to improve their collective skills and resources. In other words, before actions can happen, communities need to make sure they're ready to do the things they need to do to implement the policies and sustain the results they want. It is critical, through a trauma-informed lens, to promote community members' full participation in all of the different phases of the policymaking process that we went over in an earlier module by cultivating authentic and meaningful community engagement. Community ownership is present when most community members have considerable and detailed knowledge of the issue and local efforts, and when most segments of the community are highly supportive and actively involved. Ideally, diversified resources and funds are secured and efforts are ongoing. That's how we get sustainable policy implementation. And these empowered communities, by the way, can be geographic communities or communities of identification, like those belonging to a disproportionately impacted minority group. Something that can be really helpful is to have a peer-to-peer type system, or even a mentoring system, where you pair constituents together to support one another in their advocacy efforts. Additionally, I know at this point I probably sound like a broken record, but engaging with those who are already leaders in communities impacted by policy advancement can help eliminate systemic barriers that stand to oppress and disempower communities, while also generating trust in the policy process and opening additional doors for direct civic participation. And finally, if there is no bill already in action, and a legislator with whom you've built a relationship asks for your help developing model legislation to then finesse themselves into something that they're comfortable submitting, you can start by trying to find pre-existing policy language from another venue or jurisdiction. State legislation actually catches on quickly in other states sometimes, and the legislative process is made easier in neighboring states when that happens. It can also influence the federal policymakers to take up an issue, so this could really contribute to building substantial momentum. You may, of course, want to refine model language to be consistent with your own policy objectives. It's usually much easier to amend existing policy than it is to start from scratch. If nothing else exists, you may have to write new language, and so I will say to actually craft a policy from scratch requires expertise and meticulous attention to detail, and generally would be drafted with assistance from lawyers and experts. Consider who in your network you may be able to tap who already has experience in this nuanced space. And please do consider the importance of letting people with lived experience who are most impacted by the issue and policy change take the lead in identifying their needs and reviewing it if the policy drafts that you devise fit those needs. Remaining aware that, due to oppressive systems and institutions, options and experiences are not equal for all. Policy that is informed by first-hand experience of an issue is much more likely to be successfully implemented and maintained because it trusts impacted folks as experts of their own experiences, and thus is much more responsive to the true needs and preferred solutions that they have, rather than ones that we might be assuming. Planning who will be involved in implementation and what their roles and responsibilities will be is also an important component of any policy measure. This is a great time to think about how you can develop strong policy language and enforcement mechanisms to increase the likelihood that your trauma-informed policy is faithfully implemented should it become law, and also consider which agencies will lead in that implementation. It's advisable to be as thorough as possible when defining and plotting out provisions, because then you're more able to avoid people misinterpreting or misapplying your policy proposals. You'll want to consider what might help or hinder the enactment of your policy. Maybe you're concerned about a key term being purposefully misinterpreted to form an argument against your legislation's passage, so you choose to define it up front using a well-respected, bipartisan source right in your policy proposal. Additionally, it can be helpful to consider resources that are already in place and what else is needed to implement a policy. This could be funding, staffing, infrastructure, or any other number of relevant factors. You'll want to be aware of this because inevitably other legislators are going to ask because they weigh whether to support the policy change or not on factors like this. Your policy may also be more successful if it proactively factors in sustainability and how to navigate different economic and political climates in ways that still allow the policy to enhance well-being in the way it outlines, even in the face of great change. Committees often will look to impact reports to understand those administrative, programmatic, fiscal, and other aspects that could impact sustainability.